And you've probably heard the phrase bread and circuses before, right? Well, that refers to the fact that the Romans did everything they could, the Roman leaders, to make their people stupider, right? I'm not exaggerating, right? So we know about the Colosseum shows, right, where they would have these big Colosseums and they'd have people fighting each other to the death, or they'd have, lions or wild animals eating people. What was the purpose of that? Well, the purpose was to try and make Romans stupid, sadistic, cruel people who could then go out and do all the awful, horrible things that were necessary to make the empire continue to function, right? And you can see this all throughout Roman society. There was just a constant effort to try and promote the most barbaric and primitive aspects of people in order that they could be good soldiers who could carry out the atrocious deeds that were necessary to make the Roman Empire function. One practice that was very widespread in ancient Rome was infanticide, right? When a baby was born, there was a ceremony, right? It would be taken from its mother, and then there would be a ceremony where the master of the house would decide whether to accept or to reject the baby. And if the master of the house rejected the baby, they would take it and just throw it in the forest or throw it into a river, right? And this was done in some cases. Maybe the baby was deformed, maybe the master just didn't have enough money, maybe the master wanted a boy and it was a girl. For whatever, they would just throw these babies. Think about what kind of person could do something like this, right? What kind of person could take an infant newborn baby and just throw it away? Well, if you can picture the kind of person that would do something like that, that's the kind of person the Roman Empire worked very, very hard to cultivate. They wanted that kind of person, someone who could be that heartless and sadistic and cruel. And actually, this practice of infanticide played a very key role in one of the founding myths of the Roman Empire. So the legend that they believed was that it was started by two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. That these twin brothers were born and that their father had rejected them and left them to die by a river. But then from the forest came a female wolf, a she-wolf, right? Came and nursed them, so they were able to live, right? And they were raised by wolves, wild predators, right? And it was because they were raised by wolves, because they learned to be like these carnivorous animals, that they became strong enough that they could go out and build an empire. And that's how the Romans saw their relationship with the world, right? The rest of humanity were the sheep, and they were the wolves. Might makes right. I think that a lot of the Ayn Rand libertarian types would fit in very, very well in the Roman Empire. Not all Romans could necessarily buy into this mindset. And that's an interesting thing. Not all Romans were necessarily capable. There were some Romans that were smart enough to just not be okay with this way of thinking that was so widely promoted by the empire. Karl Kautsky tells us that among the Romans, there were basically two schools of thought. Among the Romans, you had hedonists and Stoics. And your typical Roman was a hedonist, right? A hedonist is one who thinks that pleasure is the highest good, right? That living for pleasure is the highest good. Your typical Roman went to gladiatorial shows and bet. Your typical Roman, went to wild parties, drunken sex orgies, all kinds of stuff. Overeating was considered to be a really pleasurable thing to do. People would just stuff their face full of food. And it was very common for people to then make themselves vomit after stuffing themselves full of food so they could then eat even more food, right? Now, some people say incorrectly that the Romans had a room called a vomitory. Well, actually, the vomitory was a hallway. That's like a mistranslation. But the practice was very widespread. In fact, Emperor Claudius had a servant with a big, long feather. And what the servant would do is after Claudius had stuffed his face full of food, the servant would come and stick the feather down his throat so he could then vomit up all the food and go and eat some more. And that's really gross. It's really disgusting. But in addition to that, you have to remember that at this time, most of humanity was malnourished. So to engage in that kind of behavior is just, it's beyond you how people could act that way, right? But like I said, not all Romans necessarily bought into it. You had those hedonists, but then you also had Stoics, right? Stoicism was very popular. You had a lot of Romans who felt like something was wrong. Something was just wrong with the society that they lived in. There was just something that was not right about it. So, they tended to follow what they called the cults, right? The Romans had their gods, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, that were their standard gods. But they were always importing new gods from Egypt and from Persia and from different parts of the world, right? These new gods that they would bring in. They would follow philosophers, like Seneca was probably the most famous of the Stoic philosophers. And he urged people to live a simple life and be frugal. And people used to laugh at these Stoic philosophers because a lot of them were huge hypocrites. They'd be going around the world saying, live a simple life, don't have great wealth, while charging people lots and lots of money to listen to them and becoming very, very wealthy and going as far as demanding that people who didn't pay to come to their lectures be dragged away and arrested. You know, the hypocrisy was rather extreme. It's a subject of a lot of Roman comedies, is making fun of these Stoic philosophers. But, you know, the Stoic philosophers, the Stoicists, they often engaged in bizarre rituals when they were worshiping these gods that were imported. They would flog themselves, whip themselves. For example, another thing that they would do is, unlike the hedonists that were gluttonous and overeating, they would do the opposite. They would starve themselves, you know, they wouldn't eat. In addition to that, you know, they took hallucinogenic drugs. That was very, very popular among the Stoic philosophers. And neither the hedonist school of thought nor the Stoic school of thought was capable of saving Rome. Because if you think about it, both hedonism and Stoicism, both of them are self-destructive philosophies. One is making yourself just like a primitive animal, right? Trying to basically just chase after pleasure like a dog. The other philosophy is really about self-destruction and the hope of finding some enlightenment and the hope of getting to some higher truth, torturing yourself, whipping yourself, trying to live a life of poverty. Neither of those viewpoints could have actually saved the Roman Empire. But every so often there is, you know, kind of a source of irony in history, because the Roman Empire was completely reactionary, right? It was trying to hold back the wheels of history. But it was the place, it was in ancient Rome, that the greatest class in all of history emerged. Because it was in Rome that you had the first proletarians,